Stop what you're doing right now and listen. NATO just did something massive for Ukraine. Putin should be concerned, as NATO has just signed a death sentence for Russia. How? Well, as we speak, the Collective Defense Alliance is working on a new plan that will provide Ukraine with exactly what it needs to end the Russian invasion once and for all: cold, hard cash. And if NATO decides to go ahead with its plan, and all indicators suggest that it will, Putin will be terrified of the ramifications. Not just for the Ukraine war, which will already be massive, but for what all of this means for Putin's plans to take on NATO once the war ends. And it all starts with a Ukrainian appeal. On June 11th, Politico reported that it had just spoken to a senior Ukrainian defense official. The outlet didn't say who. The official wanted to remain anonymous. But that official said that Ukraine is gearing up to make a huge request at the next meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, which is also known as the Ramstein format. These meetings are used to formalize military aid deals for Ukraine, and the official made it clear what Ukraine is going to ask for. Everyone sees that Russia is burning, and we want to burn even more, but we need financing to do it, the official declares. How much does Ukraine want from its European and NATO allies? About $20 billion. It's a big ask, and Ukraine knows it. The plan, the official tells Politico, is that allies will be asked to contribute between $2 billion and $6 billion each to reach the target, and Ukraine will be happy to take that money as either military aid or a loan that it has to pay back. But for Ukraine, which already spends 40% of its gross domestic product or GDP on its military, an extra $20 billion would add substantially to the $38 billion already committed to Ukraine by NATO nations for 2026, and bring the country within touching distance of the $60 billion in bilateral aid target set by NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte back in May. Ukraine is going to set out its stall, but it may not have to wait for NATO to give the green light. As news has leaked of Ukraine's upcoming request, you can be sure that the leaders of NATO's member nations have already seen it. They know what's coming at the Ramstein format, and they're ready for it. Ukraine is going to ask for $20 billion. Well, NATO just said, hold my beer. It's not going to deliver $20 billion to Ukraine. What happens next will catch everybody off guard, as NATO is preparing to deliver a lot more than that to the one nation that is battling back against all of Putin's ambitions for Europe. What NATO is preparing to do right now would be a death sentence for Russia's invasion, because it would guarantee a flow of cash into Ukraine that goes far beyond what even Ukraine itself is asking. NATO sees Ukraine's request for $20 billion, and it's on the verge of agreeing to raise that request to over $80 billion. That's what Politico reports that NATO nations are offering in terms of military aid to Ukraine for the rest of 2026. The outlet spoke to 4 NATO diplomats who said that a proposal being circulated by Germany is currently under discussion within NATO, and it seems that proposal is edging closer to being agreed upon. If all goes well, NATO's $80 billion offer will be made at the Ankara summit of NATO leaders about a month after the upcoming Ramstein meeting. What a huge result that will be for Ukraine. It goes in asking for $20 billion, and it comes away with more than 4 times what it's asking for from the allies that are playing a huge role in ensuring that Russia's attritional war in Ukraine isn't won simply because Ukraine ran out of the cash that it needs to keep on fighting. A 5th NATO official tells Politico about the reasoning behind the offer that the Collective Defense Organization is preparing to make. The key is to have a firm commitment from Ankara to continue the crucial support to Ukraine on a sustainable and more equitable basis, the official says. But there's more to it than that. As part of this new funding, a mechanism will be put in place to ensure that all NATO allies, along with Ukraine itself, can see who is donating what. That's key to the entire proposal getting over the line, as there are some within NATO who believe that they are shouldering the burden for supporting Ukraine more than others. The Nordic countries, including NATO's newest members in Sweden and Finland, are among them. Back in November, the Swedish Foreign Minister Maria Malmer Stenergard had pointed out that the Nordic nations are taking on a disproportionate amount of the aid burden. The fact that the Nordic countries, with less than 30 million people, we provide for 1/3 of the military support that the NATO countries, with almost 1 billion people, provide this year. This is not sustainable, it's not reasonable in any way, and it says a lot about what the Nordics do. But it says even more about what the others don't do, Stenergard declared. A very pointed message, and one that the rest of NATO's members needed to hear. At the time, Sweden's foreign minister suggested unfreezing Russian assets held by European countries and delivering them to Ukraine. That still isn't an option that's on the table for those who hold the assets, though those assets are being used to underpin the $104 billion loan that the European Union has pledged to Ukraine. So the frozen assets are out, at least in terms of the idea of simply handing them to Ukraine. What's in is a new NATO proposal that will see over $80 billion land in Ukraine's lap, ready to be used to shove Putin's invasion right back where the sun doesn't shine. Here's what we know about the NATO proposal so far. First, we mentioned that this is a German proposal. The reason that it exists in the first place is that another proposal has been shot down by NATO's members. Back in May, at around the same time that Rutte set a target of $60 billion in aid for Ukraine, NATO's Secretary-General also proposed that each member of the NATO alliance dedicate 0.25% of their GDP to supporting Ukraine to hit his target. That approach, though equal when it comes to GDP, would naturally have led to some nations contributing far more to Ukraine than others. Germany, for instance, had a $5.048 trillion GDP in 2025, according to Statista. Giving 0.25% of that GDP to Ukraine would amount to a little over $12.62 billion, which is about a fifth of Russia's entire $60 billion target for 2026. The proposal required nations to make a consistent commitment to Ukraine that they wouldn't be able to adjust if domestic issues meant that they faced financial challenges. So it was rejected by several NATO nations, including France and the UK, putting the kibosh on Rutte's suggestion. The $80 billion in aid that is now being proposed under Germany's new mechanism started gaining traction following the refusal of Rutte's idea. NATO's new plan offers more flexibility, rather than tying member nations into donating 0.25% of their GDP. Plus, it ties into the European Union's loan, which we mentioned earlier. Politico reports that Germany's plan accounts for almost $35 billion in loan funding that has already been committed by the EU, which leaves about $45 billion to be provided via bilateral aid programs, assuming the proposal makes it through the negotiating stage and into Ukraine's hands at the Ramstein format. So there's a spoonful of sugar that will make the medicine go down far easier than it would have done under Rutte's proposal. To hit the $80 billion to be offered to Ukraine at Ankara, NATO's members have to collectively find less money than they would have to commit with a GDP-based plan. Speaking of money, this offer would also represent a substantial increase in the amount of funding being provided to Ukraine by NATO's members. In a June 4th analysis, the Kyiv Institute reported that Ukraine's NATO allies are still maintaining funding at a relatively high level. Germany, for instance, allocated about $4.8 billion to Ukraine in both March and April, which was used by Ukraine to procure air defenses and drones. The UK delivered about $1.5 billion in aid during the same period, and other NATO nations delivered aid in the region of hundreds of millions of dollars over those months. So it's not like NATO nations aren't already spending big to help Ukraine. It's just that now they're gearing up to do more. And more money is always better for Ukraine when it comes to defending its territory against Russia's invading forces. What we're seeing here is NATO striking a compromise between commitment and protecting Ukraine. Suggestions have been considered and discarded, but now, with Germany's proposal, Ukraine is on the edge of receiving more funding than even its most ambitious officials expected to get. The $20 billion to be requested at the Ramstein format is on the verge of being quadrupled following the Ankara summit, and that's huge for several reasons. But before we dig into what those reasons are, if this is the kind of insight that you want to see, then you need to ensure that you're subscribed to The Military Show. We break it down like this every single day in our videos. So another $80 billion flowing into Ukraine's war chest matters. Here's why. First, this isn't just about helping Ukraine for NATO. There's a large degree of self-interest at play here, as many in Europe believe that NATO member nations are next on Putin's docket, assuming Russia's leader is able to win the war in Ukraine. One of the doomsayers is Lieutenant General Christian Freuding, who is the head of Germany's military. In a stark warning delivered on June 11th, he said that it's not a matter of if, but when Russia will invade a NATO partner country. All 32 NATO partners agree that Russia might have the capability to invade a NATO partner country in 2029, Freuding claims, adding, 2029 is not a German timeline, it's NATO-agreed intelligence. Russian military installations are being built up on NATO's borders as we speak, as construction work along the borders with Finland, Sweden, Norway and the Baltic states appears to be leading to the modernization of bases capable of holding around 115,000 troops, TVP World reports. Russia unleashes hybrid warfare attacks against NATO members regularly, as we saw in Romania toward the end of May, when a Russian drone struck an apartment block in the country. These sorts of incursions are getting more regular and, as Romania discovered, more dangerous. These are warning shots being delivered by Russia. Freuding says that it's about time that NATO started taking them seriously. Committing over $80 billion in military aid is an example of NATO taking things more seriously, as it's a clear recognition of the fact that NATO needs Ukraine. Though Ukraine isn't a NATO member, and the prospect of it becoming one is enough to send Putin into so much of a fury that it's impossible to predict what he would do next, it's fair to say that Ukraine is essentially acting as the front line in the war that Putin wants to start with the Collective Defense Alliance, and it's been serving in that role for over 4 years. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky certainly holds that opinion. On June 9th, he pointed out that Ukraine's battlefield experience alone makes the nation an asset to NATO, stating, "There is no price of this experience. It's not about money, it's about people's lives. We will share this priceless information. Having Ukraine in NATO is in the interest of NATO," Zelensky declares. NATO isn't going to let Ukraine in, at least not when the war with Russia still rages. However, Ukraine is more valuable to NATO now than many of its member nations. As the European Council on Foreign Relations points out, an end to the Ukraine war in any way that doesn't result in Ukraine's victory means that Russia will have time to position troops in preparation for the 2029 assault that Freuding says is coming. Ukraine needs to fight on, for NATO's sake as much as its own, and NATO knows it. So by committing $80 billion in aid for 2026 to Ukraine, NATO would be sending a clear message to both Ukraine and Russia. For the former, the support would show Ukraine that NATO recognizes how vital the country is as a frontline force against Russian aggression. And for the latter, $80 billion in military aid is money that Putin never expected Ukraine to receive, and it sends a clear signal that NATO has woken up to the fact that strengthening Ukraine now is the key to crippling all of Putin's plans for the future. If Ukraine falls, NATO countries are next for Putin. NATO has to stop that from happening at all costs if it doesn't want to see all of Europe plunged into war, and more military aid is the best tool that the alliance has. But speaking of NATO, there's a nation that has rather conspicuously gone without mention in this video: the United States. Ever since President Donald Trump entered office, the US has felt more like a wild card in the Ukraine war than it did under former President Joe Biden. Ukraine's relationship with the US has been tumultuous over the last 18 months, and though there is more stability now than there has been in a long time, the fact remains that the US isn't providing aid to Ukraine at the level that it was in the past. Some aid is still reaching Ukraine, though most of this was agreed under the Biden administration. But for the most part, as Politico points out, the Kiel Institute report that we mentioned earlier recorded no new military aid from the US. Militani adds that the Trump administration's request for a record-breaking $1.5 trillion defense budget for the 2027 fiscal year includes no indication that any of this money will be dedicated to Ukraine. That's the reality for Ukraine right now. The billions that were coming from the US under Biden have dried up under Trump. In place of America's aid is the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List, or PEARL, initiative, which sees Ukraine's NATO and European allies committing money that allows Ukraine to buy weapons from the US. PEARL is basically a middle ground solution that allows Ukraine to get its hands on American weapons without the US having to donate them. But the fact remains, and seems unlikely to change, that Ukraine isn't getting much, if any, new military aid from the US for as long as Trump is president. That casts the $80 billion that NATO is preparing to pledge in a new light. That money is primarily coming from NATO's European members. There's no word on whether Canada will be involved yet, but the US almost certainly won't be. For Ukraine, this amounts to the rest of NATO stepping up to plug a gap that has been left behind by the US. This money is needed. The rest of NATO is ready to provide. As a little coda to this point, some in the US are trying to get the wheels turning on aid donations, so perhaps we can't discount the nation from the military aid equation just yet. In a June 12th report, the Kyiv Independent says that the US Senate Armed Services Committee has voted to extend US aid to Ukraine to the tune of $750 million as part of the 2027 budget just mentioned. However, this is just a bill, not a given. It still has to pass through the full legislative process, including debate and approval from both chambers of the US Congress. Still, it's a start, and it's one that Ukraine hopes could signal the revitalization of US aid to go along with what the rest of NATO is doing. Finally, there's Ukraine itself. $80 billion from NATO goes a long way towards solving problems and building on military solutions for Ukraine. On the problem front, Ukraine has spent a lot of money on defending itself against Russia. and that has created what the BBC calls an urgent fight on the financial front line. The outlet reports that Ukraine's government spending for 2026 is planned to reach $112 billion, with 60% of that money going to the country's armed forces. That spending leaves Ukraine with a shortfall of around $45 billion in its budget. $45 billion is precisely the amount of extra money that NATO's new proposal would put together on top of the $35 billion that has already been guaranteed to Ukraine by the European Union's loan mechanism. Those pieces fit together far too well to be coincidental. As for what Ukraine can do with the money, air defenses and drones are the priority, and the latter are already proving to be the game changer in 2026, as Russia's military struggles to make any meaningful progress in a spring-summer offensive that was supposed to cripple Ukraine. During the spring session of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister, Mstislav Banik, told attendees that Ukraine has the ability to scale up its drone production to a staggering 20 million units per year if NATO allies are willing to commit more money. That's 5 times more drones than Ukraine built in 2025, and it could become a reality if NATO pulls the trigger on Germany's proposal. Ukraine's drones are making a massive difference in the war right now. The country's drone advantage is already pronounced as Ukraine struck 180,000 Russian military targets in May, which is a 12.7 increase over April's numbers, per the Commander-in-Chief of Ukraine's Armed Forces, Oleksandr Syrsky. He says that Ukraine already has a 1.5 to 1 advantage on the FPV drone front, has built a formidable stockpile of interceptor drones that stop Russian Shahid drones in their tracks, and is building up a mid-range stockpile that is allowing Ukraine to shatter Russian logistics. Imagine all that Ukraine is achieving multiplied by up to 5, all due to more NATO funding. Russia would go from being stalemated in Ukraine to being forced to actively withdraw as Ukraine's drones wreak havoc on the battlefield. That's the possible future that lies in wait for Putin and his forces. A lot depends on Ankara. We'll learn in July whether NATO's proposal to grant $80 billion in aid to Ukraine becomes a reality. But now we have to wait and see what NATO's members decide to do on the financial front. But we know for certain that NATO is making other moves to show Putin that extending the war beyond Ukraine would be a very bad idea. Something massive is happening on Russia's borders with NATO nations, as defenses and new command structures are being put in place. If you want to find out more, watch our video to discover what else NATO has up its sleeve. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show, as we bring you the news from Ukraine that you don't often see in mainstream media. And thank you, as always, for watching.